Good evening, good evening. And Justice Council podcast. We are coming to you live, dealing with a number of issues as it relates to public affairs and religious liberty. I'm one of your co-hosts this evening. My name is Pastor Paul Goodridge, and I serve as the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director for the South Central Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. And joining me is
Derek Lane.
No. The Dr. Derek Lane.
Hey guys, how are you? It's so good to be with you. I mean, I'm excited about the program.
Absolutely.
We've got an incredible lineup of guests, and I'm happy to be here with you as my colleague and former classmate, as well as the guests that will be joining us. And so, you mentioned that you represent the South Central Conference.
Mm-hmm.
And can you tell us what areas does that encompass? And for those that may not be familiar with our
okay,
division.
so the Seventh-day Adventist Church in North America is especially in the United States is made up of various entities and various regions. And one of the regions that I cover as the South Central region is Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, and parts of Florida, namely the panhandles of Florida. And so that's the region that I cover. And as I said, I'm the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director covering that particular region in the United States.
Great. So,
where are you from?
Yeah, so I am in Seattle, Washington.
Wow.
And I'm the representative. I'm standing in behalf of my good friend Byron Doolin. And he's asked me to represent the Pacific Northwest Territory. It covers Alaska, Montana, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. And we call it the Pacific Northwest Union Conference. But we're happy to be here as well, and happy to be with our guests and to those who are joining us. And we just appreciate those of you who are tuning in. I see a number of folks responding already. And I don't know if you wanted to do it or if you wanted me to do it, but just to remind the folks or just ask them if they had questions or wanted to respond. How do they do that? Can they just put it in the chat?
Yeah, just go ahead, put your comments in the chat, put your questions in the chat. We want to be able to hear from you. We want to be able to respond to you. We have guests who are most knowledgeable in this area. And so we want to be able to take the opportunity to ask questions and to have some of the burning questions that you may have answered. I actually want you to go ahead and let somebody know, those of you in the chat, those of you who are joining us, invite somebody else, let them know to come and join the program. As you know, I'm not sure if you're joining us from Facebook or from YouTube, but you can go on the Conscience and Justice Council YouTube page or Facebook page, and you can join us live from there. And so just take a moment to text somebody, tweet somebody, call somebody, shout somebody, so they can come and join us as we delve into this program. So we have an exciting program. The topic of our program is advocating for housing justice. Yes. And it's something that either has or will affect each and every one of us. And there are varying levels and varying ways in which we've been called to advocate for housing justice, and a number of different ways in which we are experiencing injustice when it comes to this area of housing. I know that's something that's a burning passion of yours, Dr. Lane.
Yeah. And like I said, I'm excited. We've been involved in housing issues for years as a developer, as a faith-based practitioner, and currently as a board member for a a housing development, a housing organization here. In fact, our guest is the executive director, and I serve on his board. And I know we have some other panelists coming aboard that will be joining us.
Yes.
Are steeped in experience, not just with housing directly, but with housing issues and the challenges around advocating not only for those who are unhoused, for affordable housing as well. So I'm excited. I'm excited.
All right. Well, why don't we go ahead and introduce our guests and, kind of try to dive into the program. I don't know how we're going to fit everything into the time that we have, but we'll do the best that we can. So again, my name is Paul Goodridge. I serve as the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director for the South Central Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. And joining me is Dr. Derek Lane, who serves as the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Representative for the North Pacific Union of Seventh-day Adventists. We have one other individual who will be joining us briefly, Dr. Alan Martin, who is the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director for the Northeastern Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, which covers the region of New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and I believe a little bit of Maine as well. I don't remember. But so we will serve as your co-hosts, but we are very excited about our guests who will be joining us. And so I'll introduce those guests and we'll kind of talk as a panel and share. I want to introduce Antonio McGinnis. Antonio serves as Executive Director and CEO of the Huntsville Housing Authority in Huntsville, Alabama. And as such, one of his goals is to open the eyes of the public as to what the Housing Authority can do for his community. He's opened the Envision Center, a facility and program that's based on 4 pillars: economic empowerment, educational advancement, health and wellness, and character and leadership. And these programs are a holistic approach to foster long-lasting self-sufficiency. He's actually a published author of 2 books, but especially his second book, Life in the Bricks, chronicles the life of he and his 3 brothers as they fought to make it out of one of the toughest public housing communities in Huntsville, Alabama. So welcome, Antonio.
Hey, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
All right, glad
Can
to
you
have
hear me? Can you all hear me?
We can hear you. We can hear you.
I want to say welcome to Antonio as well. I hadn't seen this brother in probably 20 years. What is going on, my brother?
Hey, it's good, man. Everything's well.
Good
seeing you as well.
Man,
Right.
we had an early start following in another life at one of the homeless youth programs in Huntsville called Harris Home for Children. So yeah, but it's good to see you, man.
Good to see
So
you.
Yeah.
we also have Donald King. Donald King is a founding member of the Nehemiah Initiative and serves as the executive director of the Nehemiah Initiative Seattle. Now, the Nehemiah Initiative is a faith-based community development initiative, and its mission is to empower the African American community in the Seattle region and beyond to support the retention of historically Black institutions by advocating for development of real property assets owned by those historically Black institutions. He is an architect, a planner, an educator with over 50 years of professional experience in the planning and design of community projects. Welcome, Mr. King, Donald King. Welcome to the Conscience and Justice Council program.
Well, thanks so much. I am honored to be here and to be a part of this panel.
All right, great. I believe we have another guest, and if he's not here yet, he will be coming on. But I will go ahead and introduce him, and that is the Reverend Dr. Peter Cook. He serves as executive director of the New York State Council of Churches. He's a strong advocate for the development of affordable housing. In fact, he helped to establish Chapel Garden Senior Apartments, which is a 22-unit tax credit financed affordable housing development for seniors and people with disabilities. He currently serves as vice president of the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative and is directing the council's Who is My Neighbor community development initiative to help faith institutions use their property to better serve their town. Dr. King, Reverend Dr. Peter Cook, welcome.
It's wonderful to be here. I'm such a pleasure to be with such a distinguished group of individuals from all over the country. So.
Absolutely. Well, we are so happy to have you. And Dr. Alan Martin, you're here. Dr. Alan Martin serves as the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director for the Northeastern Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. So, Dr. Martin, we want to jump into the program, and I know that you want to begin with a question for Mr. McGinnis.
All right. Mr. McGinnis says here, we'd like to know from your perspective, dealing with underhoused individuals, what is the impact of the housing crisis on the everyday lives of people in our country? What are some examples and real life situations that help to put the housing crisis in human terms?
Well, I think first and foremost, we feel at the Housing Authority that housing is a basic need. And when you start to think about the impact that has on individuals, especially families with children, you think about children who go to school every day and, they don't have a place to stay, and we're talking about educating these children, and all they're thinking about is where I'm gonna sleep tonight, what am I gonna eat? And without having that basic need met, they can't function and they cannot be the youth that we want them to grow up to be. So I really truly believe that housing is a basic need, and I think it's a foundation for a starting point for a lot of our individuals. And just to kind of put it in perspective, from where I'm from, we're at 99% occupancy when it comes to public housing, and we have over 500 people on a waiting list. And so when you start thinking about the need, I'm pretty sure there's the same need all across the country. So when you start to meet those basic needs of putting people in homes, then you can start to build them up. You can start to give them the education they need to go out, find a decent job, and hopefully put them on a pathway to be self-sufficient. Because at the end of the day, that's what you want a lot of these families to try to strive for, some level of self-dependency. And some people don't want that, but there's a lot of people who would like to be in a pathway to self-sufficiency. So I just think it's one of those basic needs that we can no longer overlook. We got to start paying a lot more attention to it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I know that when we typically think of the housing crisis, either we're looking at it from the actual affordability of housing perspective, or we look at it in terms of statistics and data, etc. And this can be for any of our panelists. I think it's important that we begin to let our audience know and try to put a human face to this issue of housing, underhousing or instability or affordable housing, etc. What are some of the real impacts, the real struggles and issues that people who don't have safe, stable, secure housing face on a day-to-day basis that we may not even be aware of? Maybe somebody can share an example.
Well, many of the unhoused many are not counted in the statistics of actually not having an address. They may have an address, but it may be temporary. Mm-hmm. They may be what's called couch surfing. They may be living with friends, relatives for 1 or 2 weeks, maybe a couple of months, but they don't have a stable residence. And I think the human face on this is something that my wife always reminds me when she sees a situation. She always says, "There, but by the grace of God go I."
Hmm.
And there are so many of us that live paycheck to paycheck, and maybe one paycheck away, one illness away, one death of a supporting spouse away from being unhoused. And this is something we all need to pay attention to, because this is something that can affect and impact all of us, and it impacts our society, our community as well. We will not all be well until all of us are well.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Cook, what have you found in New York, where you're based?
Well, I think it's really important to remember that in your church and your community, no matter where you are in the state of New York, a significant percentage of the people who come to your church and live in your community are spending more than 30% of their income on housing.
Mm.
In fact, in the state of New York, that figure is 50% of our population. That's half of the population of New York spends more than 30% of their income on housing. And a lot of those people are spending 50 or 60% of their income on housing. So when you have those kinds of percentages, and by that way, that happens in rural, suburban, and urban communities in every part of the state.
Mhm.
People are tying up that kind of money in housing. There's not a lot of money left over for things like food and medicine and childcare and transportation costs. And if you have a high deductible, healthcare policy, you could be looking at medical debt. And so this really creates a very unstable situation for so many people, some who just suffer in silence and don't really let on that they're going through this. But there are people, because of this stress, who are facing eviction. And when they get thrown out on the street, it's so hard to get another apartment, or they find themselves in a shelter, which is very destabilizing to their family. It just has a cascade effect. And we just really, really, really don't. We know how to address this crisis, but we don't have the political will a lot of times to address it.
Mm. Well, we're going to deal with a little later in the program. We're going to talk about what we can do to muster that political will to help to address the crisis. But Dr. Martin, not only do you serve as public affairs and religious liberty director, but you're also a pastor, and you've pastored churches. What have you seen has been some of the effects of those who have been underhoused, or as Dr. Cook mentioned, spending more of their income than they should on housing, which means they have less to spend on the other basic needs in life? What have you found has been some of the struggles as a pastor of the church, trying to pastor a congregation with those kind of struggles?
It is an extreme struggle here in New York right now, in terms of some individuals who are in my church, especially for single mothers that have 2 and 3 children. I helped one of my members some time ago to try to find a suitable apartment or something, and it was so challenging to go out there to look for a place that she could just rent. And the prices that these landlords are asking for places to rent, and some of these places are absolutely horrendous. You wouldn't want to put anything in them. But in New York City now, the cost of housing in some areas of this city just to rent a little 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, we're looking at $3,000 a month. In some cases, even $4,000 a month. Now, as Dr. Cooker says, who earns that kind of money? Where are you going to get that kind of money in order to live decently?
Yeah.
It's really rough. And then we have to also look at the fact now it has caused, I think, the homeless population to increase dramatically. Here in the city of New York, I believe, Dr. Cook, you can correct me, we may have about 80,000 people that are homeless now.
That's correct.
It's somewhere in that neighborhood, 80. And then now, on top of that 80,000, we've got 50,000 that we didn't ask for. That's come all the way. They're the migrant population that they've added to the ranks. So if we look at housing situation, we're well over 100,000 people up here. And then they're asking the churches to do what we can do to help. As you said, you're going to get to that later on in the discussion. But they want to know what we can do. And I might as well say this publicly. I'm so thankful for the work of Dr. Cook, who has been a fearless advocate for trying to house the unhoused in the state of New York.
Okay, great. So we've talked about the perspective from New York, and Mr. King, you are in Seattle, and so you're talking about the West Coast, and I can understand housing crisis in New York, and I can understand on the West Coast. But Mr. McGinnis, you're in Huntsville, Alabama. Surely there can't be a housing crisis here in Alabama and even in Huntsville. What's going on there?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, we have roughly 1,600 public housing units. We're at 99% occupancy. We have 500 people who are on a waiting list. We have roughly 1,700 housing choice vouchers. We always have people who actually have vouchers in their hands who can't find a place to rent. And we've actually been named the #1 place to live in the country. So we have a lot of developers who come here who really don't need the voucher like they needed 4 years ago. So it creates a problem on top of the problem. So it's a very real problem here as well. Rents are going through the roof. I think we've been affordable for so long that over the last 3 years, we've tried to catch up with the rest of the country, and it's caused a problem with people who just can't live. It takes about $33 an hour to be able to afford to live here in Huntsville right now. So if you're not making roughly $33 an hour, you can't afford to live in some of the units that have been created over the last year. And so that creates even a bigger issue, because when you start thinking about those folks who are right at entry level, who are in advanced manufacturing, who are making $20, $21 an hour, you would think that they could afford to live in this city. But as it looks, they can't afford to live here because you can't find units that are nice, that are under $1,000, $1,200. So it creates a problem even for those folks who are entry-level workers and entry-level officers and teachers. Man, they're having a hard time finding affordable units. And then also, when you start looking at what we've been trying to do with home ownership, we've really been trying to get some of our families to qualify to be first-time homeowners. And it's so discouraging because they qualify, but now they're competing with everybody else in the market. And some people can afford to pay $5,000 to $10,000 above asking price. We've had so many bidding wars here where some houses are going for $30,000 and $40,000 more than what they've been listed. And so it just continues to create problems for people to be able to afford to live here in this city.
So, we want to switch, we've kind of tried to look at the face of this housing crisis in terms of, human beings and the toll that it takes on human beings. And it's funny because sometimes when we think about homelessness, we think about people who don't have a job. But as I'm understanding, and our guests can correct me, there seems to be more and more individuals who are gainfully employed who still find themselves homeless or underhoused. Is that actually the case? And any of our guests can
Yes,
respond.
even the case of why we find so many, and particularly in the West Coast, we can see the homelessness on the streets. We can see the tent communities, and we can see the RVs parked, and people living in them. Those people generally have a job. They are in the city because the city has employment opportunities. So to feel that these people are lazy and they're houseless because they don't work is not necessarily true. It's just that the incomes they make come nowhere near the cost of the housing in the areas. Seattle is one of the most expensive cities in the country to live. It offers great opportunities. It offers opportunities for jobs at all levels. And those lower levels of people that can't afford to commute from the suburbs, but have the lowest paying jobs, and they may be cleaning the rooms in your hotel. They may be the housekeeping in your hospitals, but they can't afford to pay the rent in the cities that they're working. They also can't afford to pay the transportation costs to commute into the employment areas. So they become unhoused. It is not particularly true that it is their fault, but it has been depicted as such.
So I know we want to kind of move in terms of the faith-based community's response. And so, Dr. Lane, I know that this is something near and dear to you, and I know you have a question for Mr. King. So go ahead.
Yeah. I do. And like I said, earlier in our introduction prior to jumping on, I'm just happy to be able to connect and be a part of this conversation with our distinguished panelists. Each of them have obviously done a lot of great work in their respective areas where they serve, and I'm happy to be able to be on with my friend Donald King. We just became acquainted in the 3 years that I've been out here, and just to add a little bit more to in terms of our backdrop and why I'm just excited to be with the panel. Donald King, he has an architectural degree from UCLA. He's practiced architecture in California, Hawaii, and Washington. He's been a member of the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects since 2000, and is currently an affiliate professor of architecture in the College of Built Environments at the University of Washington. And with all of that backdrop, he still finds time to give back to the community. Just in the past couple of years, he's launched something that's near and dear to his heart, as well as a few of our faith-based practitioners and pastors here in Seattle, called the Nehemiah Initiative. He's the executive director of this organization. And in fact, I went into a building the other day, and focuses on it's a business incubator to help small businesses thrive and survive. And I saw his plaque, his name name on the wall. And for the time that we've been acquainted, he never even told me about his affiliation with Tabor 100. It's a BIPOC-led business incubator. So he just has a heart for our community, and we just appreciate having him on. Dr. King, you've been involved in building and architecture in the industry for a little while. You obviously are passionate about the work that you do, and I'd just love for you to just share with us a little bit about what is it that drew you, with all of the hats you have juggling in the air. What drew you to the Nehemiah Initiative? What is that about? And just share not only with our other panelists, but with our listening audience as well. A little bit about Nehemiah Initiative and the work that we do.
Sure. Well, the Nehemiah Initiative is an advocate for housing justice.
Mhm.
Is the simplest way to put it.
Mhm.
The Nehemiah Initiative grew out of my work in community. I've had a community-based practice for over 40 years in Seattle, and worked with a dozen or so churches in that process, and in those years working. But also began to really notice as the city began to gentrify, as its Black population began to be displaced, that churches, particularly our Black churches, have been blessed with property. That in the 60s and the 70s, when property was cheap in redline neighborhoods, they raised money from their congregation to buy additional property beyond their worship centers.
Mm.
Why? I can't even tell you. I know it's providential, because now when the community needs it most, these churches have the property in highly valued neighborhoods. Now, highly escalating prices for rent and home purchases. The churches have land right in the midst of that.
Mhm.
The churches can renew their social justice mission, as Black churches have had for over 200 years now, a social justice mission, as well as worship, that they can renew this mission with a new challenge to the very existence of African Americans in urban centers. This is happening all over the country. Some have told me it's happening in other countries. That the rise of urbanization has caused most people not to be able to afford to live in the urban centers, in the employment centers of our cities in this country. It has also been historic in the sense that since the Great Migration, African Americans over more than 100 years now have found their home in urban centers. So we're now faced with finding community and building community outside the urban centers, which has been a real struggle. Living in the city isn't for everyone, and it won't be for everyone, but we should have the choice to be able to live closest to the employment, to the educational, to the entertainment, to the cultural centers of our cities. And I felt that Nehemiah had a role in being able to do that, and being able to also retain its churches, its faith-based institutions that were also threatened with this displacement from gentrification. And how could we do that? We could do that by developing their property. Instead of just selling their property and taking the one-off payment, how do we begin to disrupt the process of displacement of its community by providing housing for its community, by providing homes that are affordable on its properties? Many of the churches are considering using their parking lots. There's a bit of angst about that, because they're thinking, oh, our parking lots are necessary now because our congregation drives 20 to 30 miles to service, and they need the parking lot when they get there. My response was, well, what if they live next door to the church? Would they still need the parking lot? So we're really looking at a change in business models for our churches. We're looking at a change in its focus on its mission. But I think most importantly, we're looking at a new mission for the Black church. We're looking at how we expand its mission of social justice into its mission of housing justice. Churches have been doing this for some time, but now it is critical. It is critical to really take up the mantle of that new challenge and that new struggle.
Well, that's amazing work that you're doing, and I know, Dr. Cook, I know with what you're doing, maybe some of this resonates with you, in terms of the role that churches and faith-based communities can play in terms of trying to repurpose um, uh, uh, buildings or facilities to be able to add to housing. So how are you seeing this from
Sure.
your perspective?
So faith communities across the state own amazing amounts of property, but it's often underutilized for a variety of reasons. In New York City, often what can happen is that you have developers come and they approach a church and say, hey, I got a deal for you. I'm going to pay you all this money. I'm going to build affordable housing. I'm going to, build this amazing worship center for you. Just sign here. And they get completely exploited.
Mm.
And so what we do at the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative with a grant from Trinity Church Wall Street is we've designed a very careful pre-development process that walks congregations through every step of understanding what they own, what their mission is, and to get good legal and architectural help to represent them and only them, to put together an RFQ and a request for qualifications or request for proposals that is then marketed and where developers can bid on these things and then to negotiate a really good development agreement, which helps move the congregation forward in terms of its mission and gives them the best deal. You have to work with developers, to build. They can be your friend, but if you don't have good legal counsel and you don't know what you're doing, you can really get exploited. So Seattle's doing some great work there. I am familiar with Plymouth Congregational Church, that's built just enormous amounts of housing there and has done so very successfully. And so churches can do this right, but they need to be smart so they don't get fleeced in the process.
Mm-hmm. So a couple of questions that I have. One, and I'll ask Antonio first, in terms of from what you're hearing, in terms of whether it's institutions, African American, historically, Black institutions, etc., that may own land or property, or whether it's churches. In what ways have you sought to tap into this, or can you benefit from this from a local level in terms of, say, the housing authority? Is it something that is proving to be successful, or how is that? How is it tracking with you?
Well, first of all, I think whenever you have individuals, whether it be a church, institution, or whomever who has land that they're willing to develop, the key is finding a developer that they can trust. The housing authority has funds that we could actually add to a project to make it more attractive to banks. We just closed a deal with a developer who not only built, well, all of his property is affordable, but we were able to set aside a certain portion of what we call project-based vouchers to that project to make it even more attractive to the banks, and gave them an opportunity to use one of our tools that we have to actually help them get finance. And so we can do the same kind of things with churches and other institutions as well, because the two entities have to come together to put their resources on the table. Developers want to make money as well, but you have a group of developers all across the country who are in the affordable housing space, and you just got to find the right folks who have the resources and tools who can come together to help organizations like mine and organizations in New York and California, wherever, but you got to be willing to sit at the table with them. And I think churches, with the land that they have and HBCUs, we're actually trying to work something now with our HBCUs here in the in the city who have land available, who don't know exactly what they want to do, but there's a need for housing for their students, for those who commute to their campuses each and every day, and they need housing as well. And if we can partner and help provide some kind of financing, then those are wins that we create for our cities, and it serves as a win because we're filling the gap that a lot of folks can't fill because of resources.
Could I just build on this
Please.
again?
Yeah.
So there are a lot of very reputable, excellent developers who can really mess this up and come in with the best of intentions, but because the church doesn't know how to talk to them and doesn't understand their interests, they can find themselves, these developers, really bogged down in churches that have poor decision-making processes, that don't have adequate legal representation, and so on. And so it's just, again, critical, absolutely critical that you have a team of people who represent you and only you. We have reputable developers in New York who say to churches, he said, get an attorney to represent you and only you to protect you from us. And I respect a developer who says that, because the developer shouldn't be expected to represent the congregation. They should be representing their interests, but in that sharing of interests, you come together with a deal that makes sense for everybody.
Well, as you'd mentioned, oh, sorry.
No, please. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as you'd mentioned, in Seattle, we have many church and faith-based institutions that do development. We also are blessed with a dozen or so nonprofit developers. So where the Seattle Housing Authority is actually secondary in the production of housing. They don't do much production of housing because we have so many non-for-profits. We would not advise any of our churches to go to a for-profit developer first, even though there are for-profit developers that are offering their services to our churches now. The other thing that the Nehemiah Initiative does is we do what we call the leadership and development trainings. And we're into our second session, where we'll be doing a third session soon on pre-development, to where we begin to train and teach the leadership of churches the process, the terms, the legal ramifications, the financial ramifications of development. Not to the point to where they become developers, but to the point to where they understand and can speak the language of development, to where they understand a basic knowledge of what's going on, so they can make timely decisions, so they can set their priorities and have a developer understand what those priorities and expectations for the development are. So this is one of our signature programs. It's leadership and development. We have another one called the Sankofa Beloved Community Development Fund, to where we actually raise the money to do pre-development, to get churches on the first mile of their journey in development, that they don't have to raise a dime or spend a dime in the riskiest part of the process, and that is setting it up and understanding what the feasibility of your project is. The third that we have is the Black Home Ownership Initiative partnership, to where we're looking at actually having home ownership opportunities on some of our church properties as well. So we have the three signature programs. We're very focused on those programs, but I think those programs offer our faith-based institutions a lot of information, a lot of knowledge base, a lot of ability to make decisions and to shed the fear of development, to demystify the development process and make them knowledgeable players in the arena.
Okay, so let me try to drill down a little bit. Help me to understand. I'm a pastor of a church. I have 100 acres somewhere that we own. Not really sure what we want to do with it, but I feel the need as I'm driving to my church every day. I see the homeless among us. I see the panhandlers. I see those who need help. How do I, you kind of talked a little bit about find a developer that you can trust, get an attorney, etc. But let's say the unit is built. Who owns the unit? How is it subsidized? How does this process work? Any of our guests?
Okay, well, those questions you asked about who owns the property and so on, these are all questions that get asked at certain points in the process. And one step at a time. I mean, it really begins with just basically, what do you own? And what is your mission, and what are the needs in your community, and how do you want your congregation, based on what you own, to be a blessing on your community, and to get that really clear. And then, to take a look at architecturally what might be possible on your property, and to get some sense of what kinds of financing might be out there for doing what you want to do. And I mean, I just speak for ourselves as Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative. We do workshops on this. We lay out, a very detailed process, and we try to make this as easy as possible for congregations just to call us, and we kind of walk them in step by step. The kinds of questions around, who owns the property and how you manage it might begin to appear a little bit later when you have an attorney construct a request for proposals or an RFQ. And then that would be buttoned down even more when you execute a development agreement. And your attorney could also advise you whether you want to set up your own separate 501c3, which often can make sense to partner with a developer, or go on your own. And there are lots of different, approaches for how much ownership or involvement you want to have, in a particular property. So, but I just really encourage congregations not to get too overwhelmed with all the questions at the beginning, but to really focus on, we have like a list of 8 basic questions that we have congregations answer before we will even invite them to make an application for pre-development funds that pays for an attorney and an architect.
Okay. I know that we had your website on the screen, and so I'm going to ask if we can put that up again so that pastors who may be watching or may watch the rebroadcast can know where to go. Mr. King, you were going to add to that?
Only in that I agree with all that was said regarding, there's a number of choices that churches can make as to ownership. Our churches in Seattle have decided that they want to own their property throughout the development process, regardless of what kind it is. So if it's rental housing, if it's a low-income housing tax credit project, for example, they will receive some of the proceeds from the rent. So there's a second part to this too, and is how can the church be financially stable through development and post-development. If it's home ownership, if they own the land and they build homes on that, then the homeowners lease the church property, so there is income to the church from that. So that helps financially stabilize the church for survival in a gentrifying market that like we have in Seattle. And it reduces the pressure from developers that just want to purchase their property and have them move out. And that's what many of our churches have been faced with. They've taken a great sum of money because their property is worth much more than they'd ever dreamed it would be, and have left. Many have now figured out that those churches that left really didn't get enough money. They didn't get enough money for their property to be able to reestablish themselves in a suburban community, create community again, that they would need to do in a situation where the Black community has dispersed. It is in a new diaspora. So how you build community within where you are, with where you were in your traditional neighborhood, and how do you continue to own the land to do that in perpetuity? Many of these housing programs, because if they're leasing land for 99 years, it means the church can also exist for 99 years. So how do we make sure that our churches remain strong and stay in place by maintaining land ownership, but also making it still affordable for the home renter or home owner to be able to stay in the city? So number of programs we have in Seattle, as I said, number of nonprofit developers that can be trusted with the mission of the church and aligned with the mission of the church, including the idea of ownership and who owns the land. This land has been very precious to a lot of our churches. This land was purchased with money raised from the congregations. This was in redlined communities many times, and they weren't able to borrow money to buy. They weren't able to borrow money to even build their sanctuaries. It had to be raised. So it's very precious to them, and churches are often very fearful of losing their land in any kind of the development deal. So we want to make sure that they also have protections, the legal protections around creating a separate LLC for the project that does not impact or endanger the worship center or the worship facilities, breaking off that property that's going to be developed separately.
Okay.
Chairperson?
Yes.
Yes, along those lines, because I recently was involved with a project right here in the city with a developer at a former church where I pastored. The concern I think sometimes raised, and maybe I don't know if it's been addressed. I'm sorry for my stepping out. I had a service today that I'm
That's
working.
okay. That's okay.
You know, house pastors have to do double duty. But sometimes we do have to be leery and be careful with these developers because they will try to exploit the church. They've done actuary studies. They understand the terrain. They know the market. They know exactly what they're doing and what they're going to get out of that development. And sometimes our church members are not aware of this. So my question to the experts that are here, how can a church protect itself? Maybe this was dealt with. I don't know if you dealt with this already, and I'm late coming in. But what can churches do in terms of cover themselves? Perhaps have their own attorney or what, so that as they move into something like this, they're not exploited and taken advantage of. You know.
Well, again, I think they should really follow a really clear-cut pre-development process that really does not encourage them to sign anything. I mean, anything until they are ready. We've had churches that signed a deal with the developer, and then they came to an attorney later and they said, "Is this a good deal?" So I don't think there's a church in the world that should not have an excellent attorney who specializes in this stuff representing them and who does not have any financial tie to a developer that might beholden them to that developer that can't give congregations the very best advice.
I just want to add to this too. Um, make sure that your attorneys that you have represent you understand real estate development as well.
Right.
Yeah, we just, because oftentimes we get attorneys and they don't specialize in that particular area, and they can give you bad advice as well. But I also I think somebody said ownership of land is key. You don't want to sell your land either. You want to keep your land and develop long-term lease obligations with the developer so that you can continue to receive those benefits for a very long time. Oftentimes, as soon as you sell your land, then you lose ownership, and developers then can come in and do whatever they choose to, because now it's their land and it's no longer the church's land. So I just want to say that.
Yeah, just two quick things I would say. One of the problems we have in New York City is a lot of times the financing mechanisms through the city do not allow for leasing, which is a problem, particularly for many of the churches you've described here, for whom retaining the ownership of that property is really important to them. But if you're faced with that situation, and you do have to sell parts of the land, you can condoize, and that's a theoretical term. And, for, say, a portion of the property, which is, say, sold to a partnership that you create, you basically sell a part of your property to maybe a partnership which you set up with a developer, and you have very strict rules about, what can be developed on that property and how. So it's possible to do this and retain your presence and power within a neighborhood if you can't necessarily lease. But again, you're so right. It needs to be not just any attorney who does this. It's a pretty specialized group of people who do this well. You don't want to be hiring my cousin Vinny, or somebody to come and represent you.
One of the things that Nehemiah has done is we have connected with the best land use attorneys in the city, real estate attorneys in the city, because the best are usually the largest firms, and the largest firms generally have a pro bono budget. So what we'd like to do first is find firms that can provide pro bono services. So keep in mind, unless churches are really, if you really have the 100 acres and you're going to do multiple projects, many of our churches do the one project, and that's one project in the lifetime of that church and that church leadership. There's no reason for them to become full-scale developers. If they choose to form a partnership, a joint venture with a developer, if leasing is not an option for them, they should do that. But again, legal advice is important for every step of the way. And again, one way to avoid a dilemma is to take it one step at a time. And that's something we've done with our churches. As a matter of fact, our pre-prepared churches, before they even get into pre-development, have mostly gone through the Nehemiah Studio, which is an interdisciplinary course that I've had set up at the University of Washington, where we bring in 4 of the departments of the College of Built Environments: architecture, landscape architecture, urban design and planning, and real estate. Graduate students that will assess the church's project and give them that preliminary information. So they really begin to learn what they don't know, right? So they don't know what to ask, what they don't know. And that's when you often wind up in a situation where you're signing an agreement, or you don't understand the full process. You may not understand the design, and you lose control. If you sell your land, you lose control of the land.
Yeah.
So that's one reason that we're saying continue to own your land, even if your land is encumbered to the point to where it's no longer valuable to you. You can't sell it, you can't borrow on it, but you still have control because you have skin in the game, as they call it. So once you have that and you have that control, you make sure that that is your primary point in every legal document. Do we continue to have control? Do we continue to own the land? Do we have a say? And do we have a knowledgeable say? So how do you become more knowledgeable in your decision making? And that's something we are there for. So Nehemiah, we raise the consciousness of yes, you can do development. We raise the funding to do pre-development, so they're not risking that just to get the feasibility. And then we're raising the knowledge base and the understanding of development in the church leadership. And those three things are key to being successful and also to being not in a place of vulnerability where you're taken advantage of.
Let me ask you, if you don't mind, let me just follow up a little bit with the question with Brother King. I had the chance, I'm here in Seattle with you. We had a chance to visit one of the Nehemiah studios. Most incredible thing. If you could just describe for our panelists as well as for the audience listening on what that collaborative interchange and exchange looks like, because you have developers in the room, you've got faith-based leaders, you've got students, helping to design some of these projects. But share a little bit about that.
Yeah. Most people that really aren't familiar with the term studio, so I use it a lot, and people say, well, what's a studio? A studio is an extended course in a university setting. It's usually used in art. It's used in architecture and in planning. Most people would know lab, for example, where you go in, it's not just a 1 hour course, it's a half a day. So a half a day in studio, 3 days a week. These students then take on the issues around the project, from everything from looking at the context of the neighborhood, the demographics, the history of the neighborhood, the history of the church, the mission of the church, hearing it from the church, giving feedback. So these students actually have a real client, they have a real project. So we do a midterm review, and we bring in specialists, we bring in developers, we bring in financial folks, we bring in other architects and planners to review what the church, what the students have done, and what the church has asked them to do. So the church really gets a good feeling for how this works in the Nehemiah studio. It's an interdisciplinary studio we've been running since 2019. It's really developed some national attention because we're the only college in the country that has these 5 disciplines within a college of built environments that work together and collaboratively. Now we're collaborating with a community-based organization. The students get real world experience. They get real clients, they get real results and a critique from other professionals in the field. So those of you that may have a university, like New York, you got several. Alabama, you've got Tuskegee. A university to work with, it can be a good resource for your churches. So we're trying to find ways that the churches can get into this journey, get into this path with least development or no least investment or no investment of dollars until they realize what they need to know and what risks they may be facing, but also to be able to do that, get a feasibility on their project without spending a dime. So if it doesn't work right, if it doesn't smell right to them, if their legal advice says this isn't right, they have an out without having to spend any money.
Okay, so we're running short of time. We do have a question that I want to ask, and then Dr. Martin, I'm going to ask this if you can kind of transition us to the last thing that we want to talk about, and we may not be able to fully unpack that in terms of civic engagement. Dealing with this housing crisis. But we have a question from R.T. Richards. It says, what is the estimated number of housing units that you think New York churches could contribute to the housing market? And then I'm going to ask that same question of you, Mr. King, in terms of the Seattle market. So, Reverend Cook, how many housing units do you think New York churches could contribute to the housing market in New York?
Boy, I would really be guessing. I mean, I mean, I think a lot, and you know, um, but the regulatory and financing landscape um, can really get in the way of churches meeting that potential, and we can talk a little bit about that in the next section. Um, I mean, if I mean, you know, hundreds of thousands of units could be built, I think, but the limits of financing and the regulatory environment, plus churches that just kind of get in their own way with, you know, dysfunctional decision-making processes can, you know, really contract the number that they can build.
Mm. And in Seattle, any idea
Well, in
roughly?
Seattle, yeah, and it is a tough question because it all depends on the capacity for the property, the zoning for the property. Can you go up? And in New York, you can go up, you know, quite a few stories. But and the willingness of the church to develop. We would say a minimum of 1,200 units within central Seattle. In the metropolitan area, we could probably grow that into 2,000 or more
Mm.
units of affordable housing
Mhm.
on church properties.
Okay. So, Dr. Martin, I know as we transition and we're talking about this idea of zoning, which has limitations on what can be done in terms of providing housing. I know that you had a question for Reverend Cook as far as how we can engage civic and governmental leaders in this process.
Well, I think that the church has to be the voice for the voiceless. Yeah, we have so many of our citizens who don't have, as we've said over and over again on this program, they don't have access to affordable quality housing. It is a national dilemma, especially in this inflated economic season that we're in. All over this country, those who are engaged in housing, let's say providing housing, will tell you that right now there's a lack of housing in the United States. At least that's what's out there. That's what they're saying. And as a result of that, prices have shot through the roof. 25% increase here and there across the board in areas like Huntsville, Alabama. We never had that down there. you never had that down there, Paul, where you were.
Mm-hmm.
But now we look all over the South. The prices of houses are through the roof. Right now in New York, we're experiencing a population shift. So many people are leaving the city because they can no longer afford to make it here. And one of the problems has to do with housing. So the church, I feel, looking at what is going on, we have to be the conscience of society, right? We have to be the ones that's going to speak up and say, look, this is a fundamental human need. And we've got to direct our attention to it. We can't sit back and just let, and I heard what Reverend Cook said early on, political will. Well, we have to help political will. Let me put it like that. Sometimes we have to be influential enough to bend political will so that it does the will of the people and not the will of the rich and famous. Because right in New York City now, one of the things you're looking at is, and I'm very concerned about it. Even the housing developments sometimes the church gets into. Some of the housing development, some of the housing that some of our churches get into, the very people who attend church can't even afford the apartments in those developments. To be quite honest with you, they can't afford it. We're having a development, and the folk who are in our church can't afford the apartments or whatever's there. That to me that's counterproductive, makes no sense. There has to be a balance with that, and the church has to speak out for those that need help.
So Dr. Cook, how do we do that? As church leaders, as a faith-based community, even as regular citizens, how do we start to engage civic leaders, governmental organizations and entities to be able to advocate for housing justice?
So I think there's a local answer, a
Mhm.
state answer, and a federal answer.
Okay, please unpack.
So the local answer really is that I think congregations tend by nature to draw inward, to sort of take care of their membership, but they don't go out into their communities to really get acquainted with who's in their neighborhoods, in their towns. And so I think it's really good for not just the pastor, but other parishioners to get out there and do a lot of listening, show up at community meetings, listen to people's stories, show up at rallies, build a whole matrix of relationships so that they're really present and seen in the community. And the second thing I would say on the local level is that congregations should have their antennae up for any proposal to build affordable housing in their community. And where there are approvals that need to be had for that housing, they should make it their business to show up at zoning board meetings. Some of these meetings are incredibly boring, but big decisions are made there as to whether this is going to get approved or not. And in general, a lot of times these meetings become less boring because you've got a lot of angry neighbors showing up saying why they don't want this housing in their backyard. And I think that it really helps if there are congregations there who hold up a more positive value about why we need to build and to make these zoning changes. And I think also everybody in the church should know that their community has a housing plan. They should know what's in that plan, and they should be asking their elected officials what they are doing to implement that plan. So that's what I would say at the local level. On the state level, really asking for, what is the pot of money available for affordable housing, both rental and home ownership. And if you have, as was the case for our governor here in New York, a proposal that calls on municipalities to require them to increase their housing stock, that you try to get behind that. Unfortunately, that plan went down in flames, at least temporarily, because so many suburban lawmakers in communities with nice church people, said we want local control and we don't want the state telling us what to do. And then on the federal level, I just would say that there's generally been a dialing back of investment in public housing, particularly, but all kinds of affordable housing. And we really need to have our congressmen on speed dial, let them know that we're paying attention. For instance, we just had a vote, 2 days ago in the House that basically raising the debt ceiling. It's going to cut a million families out of access to affordable housing, which is absolutely the wrong direction we need to be going. So congregations need to get political. They need to pay attention and speak up, because these policies have wide economic and pastoral implications for people.
Yeah. Antonio, from a local perspective in which you serve, what can individuals do, or what can churches do to try to generate or utilize the political will to make a difference in terms of this housing crisis?
I think one of the things that is going to sound crazy, but the church can't say not in my backyard either. Oftentimes, the church can be a problem just as much as anybody else. You know, we sometimes fight those folks who don't want residents to live in their neighborhood, but then we also get the church sending the same message. So we got to make sure the church is speaking a message of support. Here in the city, I often think about, okay, we want people to come to our congregations and be good stewards and pay tithes and offering, but we don't want them to live in our neighborhoods. We got to make sure that as a voice and as a church, we speak, you know, we become that voice for those folks who are not housed, because oftentimes they don't have a lot of support. And oftentimes the housing authorities become that voice. And that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to advocate for those who are unhoused. But as a community and as a church, we have to understand the need of affordable housing. We have to be advocates for those folks who don't necessarily have a voice. And then we have to hold our local politicians accountable. We're working on a project right now that could be a game changer. And the opposition that we're facing because people don't want it in their backyard is appalling. But we have to make sure that we hold people accountable, and that those folks who are in a position to make decisions, they need to understand the need. I was in one of our neighborhoods last week, and you know, it was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and right in the middle of one of our developments, there's the Salvation Army. And although we're empathetic and you know we have a lot of empathy for people who are homeless, all I could think about is this is right where our children get off the school bus to go home, and all they see all around them is people just laying in yards under trees. You know, they see a certain level of despair when they get off the school bus. And I thought about the trauma that has to play in the lives of some of those young people. And, you know, we got to start dealing with that trauma as well, because we don't like to talk about it. We don't like to talk about the impact that it has when people don't have a proper place to stay. And we got to just start being a voice for people who don't necessarily have a voice of their own.
Dr. King, you know, what can you suggest in terms of how we can seek to engage civically with our politicians and leaders, etc., with this issue?
Well, engaging civically really is just part of a picture, and just doing that would not work without building credibility, without building the relationships, without having the goodwill. We're in Seattle. We're a little bit unique to most urban centers. We're a very small Black population, and yet Seattle sits in Martin Luther King County. It's a very progressive place. So I would start with our local leadership first, our local politicians and legislatures as being the most responsive to us. That then works up the ladder, because Seattle is also the economic engine and political power of the state. So that works up the ladder to the state and state legislature, which is also very progressive and has passed legislation just this year in favor of a lot of what we're doing, including the Black Home Ownership Initiative, including allowing greater density in development of faith-based properties for affordable housing. This is something that Washington State was the first to do. I think California's got it now. Maybe it's happening in New York. So we've been blessed with being in this very progressive political atmosphere as a minority population, but still a lot of power. So if we build our relationships, if we build our credibility, the political influence is going to come for us in our
Okay. Okay. As we, begin to close this program, I do want to give each of our guests, as well as my co-hosts, an opportunity to give, like a closing thought when it comes to this issue of dealing with the housing crisis, being underhoused, what we can do as a church if we come together, what we could do as individuals, what we can do as a community. So maybe if you take, 1 minute or so to kind of give some closing remarks, and I'll begin with Dr. Lane. From your perspective and from the things that you're involved in, etc. What can you leave with us as we try to address this issue?
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been, first of all, it's just been great to be here and just to hear the insight and perspectives of so many that are dealing with similar issues around the country. I know statistically there are approximately 582,000, close to 600,000 persons who are unhoused and experience homelessness in the country. We've heard we've heard a number of those kinds of statistics just in our short and brief time together. One of the things that being engaged in the housing work with my colleague and friend Donald King, it's inspiring to, especially lately, to see the trends moving in another direction. No, we haven't resolved the problem. There are still too many. In fact, one is too many who are experiencing homelessness. And of course, as a community of faith, we need to be engaged. We need to be involved and do what we can to mitigate, to alleviate, to eliminate homelessness in this country. And for a country as wealthy as the United States of America, there's no reason why anyone should be unhoused. But I just want to applaud the work of my colleague, Donald King, as well as our other guests in the work that they're doing to bring us to that day. So thank you again so much to our panelists, and especially to those, I know we can't see them, but for those who have joined us, we appreciate your engagement and your involvement as well.
Okay. Dr. Martin, what closing thoughts would you share?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to my colleagues who are my fellow public affairs and legislative directors elsewhere, Derek, and to you, Paul. I'm so grateful to you guys for allowing me to be a part of this discussion. Okay, thank you for allowing me to join you. I'm concerned, and I'm going to say this because the ones who are actually sponsoring this program are of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I want to say to my church in particular, we are strong enough, broad enough, and well established enough in this country. We run one of the largest healthcare industries in America right now, Advent Health. We did a tremendous job getting that off the ground. And we do have housing developments. I'd like to see somehow our regional conferences and our conferences get together and have a comprehensive approach to looking at this housing situation, and also help and work along with our other faith leaders in what they're doing, so that because I think that's what it's going to take. We've got to have some cohesion to handle this, especially dealing with addressing the political will that's in this country. We have to be the ones that shape the agenda. Okay, we cannot let these politicians shape the agenda. They know how to knock on our doors and come to our churches and say, "Look, I want to say a word to your congregation, get a vote." But when it gets right down to what they need to do for the people, that's another story. We need to somehow work towards changing that narrative to help and address this critical issue that's facing us in society right now as a collective faith group.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. McGinnis, some closing thoughts or remarks in terms of what you would like to share with our audience.
Yeah, I just think we just need to make sure that we are in the room and at the table advocating for those who don't have a place to stay, and just be willing to be educated on the difference in your community, and understanding the difference between affordable and public. because I mean, you know, there is a difference, and um, just being willing to share information as much as possible, man. Because I think as a group, you know, we got to be at the table, we got to be in the room, because oftentimes we're not, and you know, we just kind of do church on our corner of the world and on the corner of the planet, and we go home every day, and we got to be in those rooms where people are making decisions about housing, so that we can have a voice, and we can, you know, have some stake in the game.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Um, Mr. King, as you prepare to give some closing remarks, I do want to ask a question that has been asked in terms of what, if any, legislation is in Washington State to give a break to churches that would
Mhm.
want to build housing. I understand that such a break or an initiative doesn't happen in New York. Is there anything, at that you are aware of happening in Washington?
Yeah, well, in 2019, we passed a state law that allowed municipalities, actually required municipalities to come up with a plan for faith-based development that provided faith-based institutions with additional density bonuses.
Mm.
In many cases, it could be a floor or more that could be added to a building in a zone that wouldn't allow it. It could be more floor area. It gave institutions, faith-based institutions, an allowance that for-profit developers did not have. So again, actually adding to their strength to be in that development world and having that control, because the property has to be owned by a faith-based institution to get those density bonuses.
Okay. Okay. And any last closing thoughts you want to share?
Yeah, it does my heart good to see all of you here, and we're working in that same direction, and we're working in a way that is collective. And I think of this and housing justice as another civil rights issue,
Mhm.
and as another human rights issue, and how faith-based institutions are the conscience of America. And working collectively, we can shift this. We can make the changes. So I would say let's keep doing it, and let's get to the work and make the good trouble to make this happen.
Okay.
Right.
Quoting the late John Lewis. So Reverend Dr. Cook, I'm going to ask you in terms of what would you want to share, some closing remarks you would want to share with our congregations, with our churches, with our leaders, with just individuals who may have a passion for this area.
Well, first of all, I'm just amazed by this law in Washington State. I mean, just to give you an example of how different it is in New York City,
Mhm.
when we put it together a set of recommendations on how to improve, make it easier for churches to develop their property, it was just like crickets trying to talk to the city. And, and furthermore, they actually punish you if you're a church and you want to develop, because they don't let you get paid for the full market value of your property, which is actually a requirement of the state attorney general in terms of being able to consummate a deal. So we are just light years behind in terms of that, and I really like to learn more about that whole thing in Washington. We need that desperately in New York. But I guess the other thing I really want to say is, we have United Methodists who are part of the Council of Churches, and I love United Methodists when it comes to clergy, because when a clergy person is appointed to their church, they're not appointed to their church. They're appointed to the community in which they're church dwells. And I think that so many pastors and congregations forget that God is calling them to serve their community, not to just serve themselves. And if you have that sort of basic pastoral outlook that is demonstrated by the clergy and is also infused into the laity as they live into their baptisms, that really becomes foundational for doing some really good things, whether it's in housing or addressing a whole myriad of other challenges in your community.
Mhm. All right, thank you. And I guess for me, what struck me the most, and what I would like to try to leave with our audience, we hear numbers, we hear statistics when it comes to underhousing, when it comes to homelessness, when it comes to the housing crisis, etc. But behind those statistics are real people, real families, real individuals who deal with day-to-day issues that those who are comfortably housed have no clue in terms of the struggle. And Antonio McGinnis talked about the psychological impact of homelessness or just underhousing. And so I would just like for us to remember that we are dealing not with numbers, not with statistics, but we are dealing with real life, flesh and blood, men, women, boys, and girls who would love to have the basic need of safety and shelter that many of us take for granted. Again, I want to thank our guests for joining us, each and every one of you. And you know, we have, and we will make available the particular websites if you want to find out more about the organizations and institutions that we've talked about, etc. So again, thank you for joining us in terms of our guests, and I'm going to be right back with some closing remarks. So again, guests, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
So as we look to close this particular session, and we've had a great session, and I appreciate it. I want to just tell you about a couple of things coming up. We will have another session again, Dr. Lane, in next month. So you know, please look out for our next Conscience and Justice Council show. But in the meantime, within the South Central Conference, and we're opening it up to everybody, we have a podcast that we do called The Public Square. And it's an opportunity where we continue to talk about varying issues, varying things dealing with public affairs and religious liberty. And we have a program coming up on May the 11th. May the 11th, we have a program called Help, I Think I'm Losing My Mind. We may need to take us off the background just to be able to see it. But it's taking place on May the 11th at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. And so you can see that from the South Central Conference YouTube or Facebook page. So we want you to be a part of that, and we'll make that available to you. We also want to let you know, as a Conscience and Justice Council, that we have our annual convention coming up. The convention will be September the 27th through October the 1st. It will take place in Maryland. It will take place at the North American Division Conference Office. Our theme is going to be, where is the church? Promoting liberty, pursuing justice. And you can go to the Conscience and Justice Council website, cjcouncil.org, and you can go ahead and begin to register for the event. And it will tell you about the hotel information that will be there. But it promises to be a superb event where we talk about things either from a conscience side, from a pastoral side, from a legislative side, etc., as we look at what we can do as a church and our responsibility as a church in terms of promoting liberty and pursuing justice. So please look out for more information as far as that's concerned. Derek, I want to thank you so much for joining me and hosting with me.
It's been good. It's been good. You know, incredible group of panelists that we've had representing different regions of the country. We thank those who tuned in and hung in here with us. I see R.T. Richards on and Rosalind Wallace from our area. It's been great, but we have to pause just a second and thank you. I'm putting it away. Yeah. You've done a great job facilitating and co-hosting this, and looking forward to an opportunity to do it again. But thank you so much, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Also have to give a shout out to our fearless leader, Ed Woods III, who's been working behind the scenes, producing the show. So it's been a team effort. But it's been very informative. And again, when we think about public affairs and religious liberty, it's not just about making sure that we don't work on the Sabbath, but it's about engaging our civic leaders to make sure that we are advocating for all individuals so that everybody can be able to exercise their freedoms in whatever way and based on their conscience. So again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time. God bless.
Take care, everyone.